Let's talk about another ammo stockpiling mistake that I see happening all the time, especially here in the preparedness community. And it's counterintuitive to the goal of stockpiling ammunition when you realize that this might be a mistake that you're making. And if you've ever bought ammo because it looked cool, then hit the subscribe button below because we've all done it at some point in time and we need to learn from our mistakes. Now, here on the table, we have a 20-inch AR-15 chambered in 5.56. That 20-inch barrel has a 1 in 7 twist rate. So this gun is pretty much set up exactly for M855 ammo. The scope is sighted in at 100 yards with M855. The offset red dot is sighted in at 50 yards for M855. And that 20-inch barrel takes full advantage of the M855 cartridge. It makes it as efficient as you possibly can, as it was designed to work with the M16A2, which also had a 20-inch barrel and a 1 in 7 twist rate. Now, that works out perfectly for me because M855 is a type of 5.56 ammunition that I stockpile. So the stockpiled ammo I have will run efficiently out of this rifle, and this rifle's optics are already sighted in for that particular load. Now, the mistake that I see happening a lot in the preparedness community, as well as in the firearms community, is that people will have lots of different AR-15s, and they'll have them tuned and sighted in for some higher-end ammunition types, generally using 77 grain open tip match projectiles or things of that nature. Projectiles that have better ballistic coefficients, have better terminal ballistics, are better for long range, and everything else. At the end of the day, they're superior rounds that have those types of projectiles. And it makes sense that people would use that ammunition because it gets everything you can possibly get out of the 5.56 cartridge without having to move up to something larger. Now, the issue that I have with that is that those people generally don't stockpile that ammunition. They set up all their ARs with that type of ammo. They sight in all their scopes and optics for that type of ammo. And then they only stockpile a little bit of it for maybe their loadout or for some magazines that they keep loaded. But in general, a lot of people still just stockpile M193 or M855, the two most commercially available types of 5.56 ammo on the civilian market. And that's also counterintuitive to the concept of why 5.56 is such a good choice for preparedness. It's not always about its ballistics and everything else that it does on the other end of the barrel, but at the end of the day, the reason it wins for preparedness is logistics, right? And everybody talks about how 5.56 is so available, and 5.56 is what the military uses. And of course, they use M855A1, which is still a 62 grain projectile, so probably still better out of this platform than some others out there. But what I'm trying to say is that the universality of 5.56 generally rests within the M193 or M855 range for civilians. And if you ever found yourself in that SHTF scenario where accessing more ammunition became important, relying on your stockpile became important, or even the proverbial battlefield pickups that may or may not exist in that time, those are the ammunition options you're going to have versus some of that higher end stuff, unless you're financially capable of stockpiling solely 77 grain open tip match or anything of that nature. So that's the mistake I see happening a lot. People will tune their ARs and tune their optics and everything else to these particular loadings, which are superior, don't get me wrong, and they're not a bad idea in any way, shape, or form. But then their stockpile doesn't match what their guns are tuned for. So if you don't have ARs specifically designed for like general purpose that are all set up just to run that ball ammo, that M193 or that M855, and if you don't necessarily stockpile the high-end ammo, but it's the ammo that you have all of your sights sighted in for, and everything else is tuned for that particular ammo based on barrel length and twist rate and everything else, then how do you expect it to work properly when you actually need it in a long-term emergency scenario? And how many of you will actually have access to a shooting range or somewhere where you can sight in your optics for the other types of ammunition you're going to encounter or that you have stockpiled in a scenario where you're going to need to use it? Or how many of you are never going to find yourself in a position where that becomes available? These are all things you really need to consider. And I'm not saying you're wrong for running these higher end cartridges, because at the end of the day, they are superior. But what do you stockpile? And if your stockpile doesn't match what you shoot, then why are you stockpiling it? And vice versa. If you're not willing to stockpile the expensive stuff just because it has better performance, then maybe you should be shooting the stuff you actually can afford and stockpile, so that's what your guns are ready to use if that time comes. And like I said, this 20-inch barrel, that's a long boy right there, right? But at the end of the day, this thing gets all of the efficiency it can out of M855, which is definitely not one of the better rounds, but it can definitely do the job in a platform like this. And that's also why the scope and the red dot are sighted in for M855 particularly, right? So this is something I wanted everyone to consider, because once you start getting all into the higher end, more exotic type of cartridges for 5.56, you lose a lot of the logistics and universality that makes 5.56 such a great option for SHTF prepping, right? But at the end of the day, there's a lot of ways to work around it. Just don't make the mistake of having everything set up for one particular cartridge if you're not willing to stockpile that cartridge, or if you don't at least have workarounds in the sense of maybe another rifle that's specifically designed for your M193 stockpile or something along those lines. But don't find yourself in an emergency situation where the only ammunition you have access to is what's available. M193, M855, or those proverbial battlefield pickups, which may or may not exist, and then only have your sights and optics and everything else sighted in for these higher end rounds that now make you off target, and have your guns set up with barrels and twist rates that don't make sense for that stockpiled ammunition. These are just things to consider. I wanted to share this thought with you. Leave me comments below about how you either completely disagree with what I said, or if you have workarounds in order to deal with that scenario that might help other people in this same situation. Because it's one of the reasons I have a 300 blackout, right? A 300 blackout has a whole different set of capabilities that I'm going to be using it for, but it also isn't dependent on the idea of universality or availability or logistics necessarily. I know that what I keep on hand for that is basically where it's at, and whatever reloading components and everything else related to it. But when it comes to choosing the 5.56 for specific reasons related to logistics, which is a lot of the times why it wins out, why are we then taking everything that makes that a positive and turning it into something negative by jumping to almost the equivalent of like a different caliber, right? Like, where are we at when it comes to 6.5 Grendel, or when it comes to 6mm arc, or any of those other things based on the same circumstance? The reason 5.56 beats those rounds is because of availability and logistics. And once you start tuning everything you own to these less available, less common versions of 5.56, and you don't stockpile that ammo and you don't have access to it after a certain amount, you're doing yourself a disservice, right? I don't know, you tell me down below, but this is a mistake I see happening a lot, and I think that there's something to be said about having rifles that are specifically set up for that stockpiled ammunition, for that available ammunition, and for the stuff that we all know we have when it's not necessarily what we shoot, right? Anything else you need from me, go to magicprepper.com, and that's gonna be it for Magic Prepper.